Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I'm great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Well, it looks like more lawsuits on the plastics front. So Attorney General Bonta is suing Exxon over so-called quote, plastic recycling deception practices. This is really the most absurd thing I've ever heard, Tim. We were all encouraged to recycle plastics for decades. Whole recycling industries have risen up because of this business of recycling. Pretty much every organization, business, and yes, even the government encourage all of us to recycle. Now, Exxon is being sued because it makes the compounds for plastics, and they are accused of everything from false advertising practices when it comes to recycling and even water pollution. So this is really, quite a cruel twist of fate, Tim, for Exxon. At one point, you're encouraging people to recycle because it's supposedly good for the environment, and then you are being sued for it. It's another reason why companies are just leaving California by droves.
That's right. And it's along the themes of what I write about in my book, The California Left Coast Survivor's Guide, which listeners can get today at their favorite online bookstore, about California's wanting to ban everything, and especially plastic. They have a war on plastic, and they'll admit it. They have a war on plastic. It's a war on convenience. It's also, once again, government trying to dictate how you live your life, and they're fighting a product and an industry that is a perfectly legal and important, and we really couldn't function in our lives without plastic. So it's the latest issue in this agenda that serves their narrow political special interests, but it doesn't serve the taxpayers of California, doesn't serve the consumers of California. And by the way, as Wayne has showed in his research, these kind of lawsuits actually increase costs for consumers. So other than for their political purposes, you wonder who is to be gained by their efforts here. Bonta and Newsom certainly aren't, looking out for the working class of California with their anti-plastic and pro-green mandate agenda.
And along those lines, the legislature is having this special session, Tim, on gas prices. Tell us about that.
Yes, so it was one of the hot things of the last night of the session, and it was a fight between the Senate and the Assembly and the governor. But the governor is, gas prices continues to be a big drag for Newsom and the Democrats. And even though gas prices have gone down, and I think some of that's consumption, right? We're back from summer vacation. We're not driving as much today. They have had this push on what's the cause for all the spikes in oil prices? Well, we know, of course, anyone who's listened to this podcast or read PRI's work knows it's actually government green mandates that add $1.40 to the price of a gallon of gas. So there's a proposal that Newsom has that he called a special session for that would basically increase the storage requirements for oil companies to have, a sufficient amount of gas on hand. Right now, they have about 2 or 2.5 weeks of supply on hand. Now, it's unclear because if you watch the hearings, no one will agree on what it is. And in fact, the text of the bill would leave it up to state bureaucrats to determine this. But we're assuming they're going to now have to have, say, a month of supply on hand. Well, that's not an inexpensive thing because you'd have to buy more infrastructure to store that additional supply, and that is pretty expensive too. And then you would also you have to produce the gas, and there's a cost associated with that. So our Wayne Weingarten has crunched the numbers, and he has come up with this. So if, for example, we require that an additional week of storage is required, that's the equivalent of a 3 cent per gallon increase in the cost of gasoline. And if it goes up to as much as 4 weeks of increased capacity, that would be the equivalent of 11 cents a gallon. So much for this proposal is going to lower gas prices for people. Based on Wayne's research, this is going to be anywhere from a 3 to 11 cent per gallon increase in the cost when you fill up. And then, of course, the impact on the economy. If you had an 11-cent increase per gallon in gas prices, the economy would lose $1.4 billion in potential growth over that first year that additional cost was in effect. And over 10 years, that would be about $18.5 billion compounded. So once again, Sacramento is pushing their green agenda and they're serving a narrow special interest. But at the end of the day, regardless of what they say, it's really consumers that are going to lose in the end. So all of these topics lead in very nicely with this week's guest on our podcast. And we have the special counsel for the Manufacturers Accountability Project, which is a project of the National Association of Manufacturers, and that's Phil Goldberg. And Phil recently filed an amicus brief with the U.S. Supreme Court on climate legislation, and he cited the work of R. Wayne Weingarten in these cases. And his position is basically that, we need comprehensive national solutions to our climate issues. We don't need these meritless lawsuits that, like we were just discussing, like Rob Bonta and Gavin Newsom are filing under state laws that really aren't effective solutions and really, result in, huge costs on employers and consumers alike. And not only are cities and the state of California filing these, there's some 24 cities, states, and municipalities across the country that are filing these types of lawsuits. So we kind of go through some of these cases and we talk about the implications of them and how this Supreme Court decision that's pending could change the direction of all of these lawsuits. So Wayne and I talked with Phil about all of these issues, and I think, you'll be, if you're interested in gas prices, you're going to be very interested in what Phil has to say.
Thanks so much, Tim.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. Phil, it's great to have you on Next Round to discuss a topic that's been an important part of our research agenda here at PRI in recent years, which is state and local climate change lawsuits. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about the Manufacturers Accountability Project and some of the important work that you're doing in this area.
Sure. First of all, let me just say how much I am enjoying being on this podcast and look forward to our discussion today. You guys do a great job, not just with the podcast, but with a lot of the work that you do and the scholarship that you put out. And so it's really my honor to be here with you guys today. So the Manufacturer Accountability Project, it's not exactly a household name, but it's operated under the National Association of Manufacturers. And the purpose of that group is to be the voice of manufacturers in explaining and also opposing this a very new and concerning trend that's happening in the courts. And what we're seeing is the local governments, mostly local governments, sometimes counties or states, are trying to treat manufacturers like rainy day funds. And so they try to blame them for if there's a social, a political, even like a local criminal issue that is going on in their communities. And then they want to sue the manufacturer to say, well, you should pay for this, even though the manufacturer didn't cause it, even though there's no connection to that. And so we see this in the climate change space. We see this in, litter and, plastic pollution. We see this even with like local car thievery. And so this is something that manufacturers as a group are very much concerned about. and don't want to be treated that, they're trying to put out lawful products, put out non-defective products, do that in a way that are beneficial to people. And then when they get hit with these lawsuits saying, well, you should have to pay because other people did something wrong with your product, or your product has certain externalities that that are impacting this, that, way, or the other. That's not what the liability system is for. And so we're trying to come out and on programs like this and explain that to people so that they have an understanding of why these lawsuits aren't appropriate.
Well, digging into kind of one of the lawsuits that you're following, which has also been a real concern for us, is these state and local climate change lawsuits. And those have been kind of filed across the country. And all of these could be impacted by a pending Supreme Court ruling. And we'll get to that case in a bit. But if we can start with the discussion of some of these individual cases, and these cases have been pursued by the city of Baltimore, New York City. At the state level, it's been Delaware. Honolulu has also filed suit, and each one of these are different, or each one of these is different. But what are some of the issues they bring forward? And it certainly, I would imagine, speaks to the importance of the Supreme Court getting it right here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Climate litigation like this has been around for about 20 years. In 2004, the first climate case was filed. It was a bunch of states suing electric utilities, saying that they were causing climate change and that the court should come in and find them liable and then apply a certain percentage reduction to their emissions over the course of several years. And then there were also claims very much like the ones that are today that were suing energy manufacturers, saying, oh no, you caused climate change and you should have to pay for the impacts that climate change are having on these local communities. And the Supreme Court said in 2011 in the first case, no, that's not the way the liability system works. And these are issues of national importance. They're legislative and regulatory in nature. And it's a good thing that we have expert agencies to handle these kinds of issues. And so the people who were behind these lawsuits, and they were really driven by their frustration with the political process, that they weren't getting the kinds of solutions they wanted to see. And they were very upfront about that in the first round of these lawsuits. But then they went back and they retooled their litigation. And this wave of litigation started in about 2017. And now they say, oh, well, it's not about policy, it's not about regulatory, but it really is. And they say what they're trying to do is get money for these local communities to pay for the impacts of climate change. But deciding who should be liable for climate change, how much liability, if there should be a penalty or a tax on carbon or other types of economic activity, those are all legislative and regulatory issues because there's so many competing factors that have to go into that. The affordability for people, where that money is going to be spent, how it's going to be collected, all of that stuff, and they're trying to do all that outside the checks and balances of the regulatory and legislative system. And so that's what's kind of going on here with all of these lawsuits. That the kind of the common threads throughout, even though each one may state their case somewhat differently.
So you recently filed an amicus brief in a case before the Supreme Court involving climate change litigation between Alabama and California. So tell us a little bit about the parameters of this case and why it's so important, certainly, and some of the main arguments of your brief.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting kind of turn or twist, if you will, in this entire litigation. So the essence of whether it's Honolulu or Hoboken, New Jersey, or Delaware, Baltimore are saying is that, to these companies, you produced and promoted and sold your fuels all around the world and engaged in this conduct all around the world that is impacting us. And in order for the companies to suggest that there should be liability, they have to say that all that activity you did in other states and other countries was unlawful. And therefore we were injured by that. And you should have to pay us. But Hawaii doesn't get to say, or Honolulu or Hoboken or Baltimore doesn't get to say what's lawful or unlawful in Texas and Tennessee and Alaska and Maine and Florida and any other state. And so they certainly don't in other countries to get to say what's lawful or not lawful conduct in those other countries. And so what about, I think, 19 or 20 states did, led by Alabama, is they filed what's called a bill of complaint in the Supreme Court saying, hey, you got to stop these other states from trying to regulate conduct in our state. You can't tell us what's lawful or unlawful conduct in our state. We think what they're accusing these companies of doing was fully lawful, and we have a right to make that decision ourselves. And so that's what this case this bill of complaint is really about. It's directly filed in the Supreme Court. It's saying it's on behalf of some states suing other states, saying those states are trying to do things that go beyond the federalism structure of our government, where states only have certain authorities within their own states, and they don't have authorities to impose law and decide what's lawful and unlawful in other states. And so our brief that we filed with the National Association of Manufacturers explains that, but it also kind of gets into why the issues that are the GHG emission issues at issue in this litigation is really federal and international in scope. It's all interconnected, and you can't have state liability law driving those those kinds of decisions, because these questions are really beyond any state's law, any state's liability law. And so that was what our brief kind of explained to the court was, you should hear this bill of complaint because these are important federal and international issues that are not meet for state law governance.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
Something that I've written about, and it relates to this issue because that makes a lot of sense, and it's also why a position that typically take that that state and local solutions are better. In this case, you're saying we need federal action to safeguard state and local rights, which is really interesting. But isn't there also like a policy angle to this? You mentioned that earlier, that they're trying to set policy through litigation, and is that part of kind of what needs to be done at the federal level?
It is. I mean, and so I know sometimes it's kind of ironic that you have some of the more some states saying, hey, this is for local control, and other states saying, no, this is for federal, and maybe they seemingly appear on the opposite sides of where you think they would normally be based on politics. But it's really about understanding the constitutional structure of the country, making sure that each state or each governing body kind of stays within its lane and does what it's supposed to do. And so when you're dealing with something like climate change that is caused by essentially everyone everywhere for 150 years, having, one state saying who's to blame for that when it's activities that are going on again around the world is not what the constitutional structure that we have has set up. And that's why, it's very explicit, when you're dealing with, things that are called interstate pollution, that one state can't sue another state over that, right? It has to go, these have to be federal issues. And they go to the Supreme Court. And so that's why, this bill of complaint is saying, hey, this is kind of the same deal. In fact, it's international in scope, not just state versus state. And so you need to take a look at this and help set down the parameters for how this kind of dispute can be resolved.
Well, as PRI's research has shown, you're seeing politicians from Governor Gavin Newsom on down to local mayors taking this litigation route to really try and resolve these thorny debates on climate change policy in their favor. In your view, what's the motivation behind these cases? Do you think they're more about trying to force policies they're pushing but that aren't winning legislative approval into existence through the courts? Or is this more about politicians using the judicial system to really try to get a headline and tick a box and say we've done something here?
I always was told never try to guess on someone else's motivation. But if you listen to what they say, at least that should be helpful. It seemingly is this fundamental disagreement in policy. And so they would like to, they believe, and I've been on these kinds of programs with people who say this, that climate change is such an important issue at this moment in time that every tool in the toolbox should be used, even if it's not fair, even if it's not the right way to do things, that they believe that if litigation can make any bit of difference, let's throw the litigation tool out there, even though this is really regulatory or legislative in nature, and they think that's kind of how it should be handled. And we very much believe that, as I said, each governance or whatever should stay in their lane. But the same thing is true with the process of how we make decisions on policy decisions and litigation, and trying to blame somebody as a way of trying to, control the public debate or whatever it is not the way we do things in this country. We sue people when they've done something that they had a responsibility not to do, and doing that wrongfully caused somebody's harm. And so that's not really what's at issue in these lawsuits. And so, at the end of the day, all of the issues that are being raised in these cases are issues that are policy issues that need to be decided by Congress, by federal agencies, and certainly, and I think we all can agree with this, it's incredibly frustrating sometimes to watch the federal government work or not work on various issues. This is not the only one. But that doesn't mean we go to the courts to try to get them to do something in lieu of the proper process and the checks and balances of the federal legislative system.
Or alternatively, sometimes people fail to take the negative message that Congress hasn't acted for a reason, and so that you're actually going against the democratic process, which is ironic. Something as an economist, not a legal scholar, I'm curious about, which is we have all these different lawsuits, some from localities in New York and California, all these Honolulu. Is there one that's particularly more kind of damaging, or it's going to impose higher costs on taxpayers and ratepayers if they prevail, or are each one of these equally troubling?
Well, money comes from somewhere, right? So if one of these lawsuits happen to succeed and they generate, revenue or settlement that comes from the people who sell us the energy that we use every day, whether it's to fuel our cars, our power factories, from our lights, all of that, it's going to become more expensive to do all of that. I mean, that's just basic economics. You're the guy who taught me that, reading your pieces on this. And so, and if you look at what the other side says, not necessarily in court, but when they're talking on programs like this, they say, yeah, this is about raising the price of energy on people. They believe that, and as one of them said, that holding the companies responsible is holding the consumers responsible. They have actually argued in some of the cases that the goal here in their mind is to make the cost of these energy products their quote unquote true cost to society. But these are real difficult public policy questions that go into, again, how much, what's fair? How much can people afford? What are you going to do with the money? How does it get spent? All of these kinds of issues that are, again, regulatory and legislative in nature, and not something that one judge sitting in Baltimore or sitting in Hoboken, New Jersey, or someplace in California can decide for everybody. This is the kind of decision that has to be decided in a uniform way.
So, of course, as you write about, another impact from a potential unfavorable ruling in these cases is a threat to investments in private sector innovation, which is ultimately the key to finding a solution to these climate change issues. So what are some of the potential future negative impacts on innovation that you're finding in these cases that you're following and involved with?
That's a great question. There's somewhat of a misnomer with these cases that these cases are about fighting climate change. I mean, they're not. Lawsuits don't reduce GHG emissions. And if you actually, the other side will actually say, oh, we're not trying to fight climate change, but even though that's really what, the underlying subtext of all of this litigation is about. So what we need is to focus on, as you indicated, the types of innovations that are going to allow us to source and use energies in ways that are sustainable for people and for the planet. Innovation is the way we've always dealt with these kinds of situations. And so, I don't think anybody would doubt that electrification in the past 100 and 150 years has been one of the most incredible advances in human health and standard of living across the globe, and the ability to refrigerate, to air conditioning, heating, all the things that we take for granted as part of our modern life, transportation, hospitals, our medicines. It's all made possible because of energy. And so when things have come up in the past with respect to the impact that energy is having on society, say like with coal, combustion in the 1970s, we spent the next 20 years dealing with how to reduce that impact. And by the 90s and the early 2000s, we saw significant change in that. And so that's the kind of approach that we need to apply here. So, okay, here's the problem, which is the GHG emissions, and the solutions are going to be to develop ways to reduce that impact so that we can both live modern life, but then also have a planet that's not going to be affected by our presence here. And so that's what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day. These lawsuits don't help get there. Not only, but innovation is the primary way that we're going to get there.
I think innovation can't be emphasized enough, because I 100% agree that the technologies we have aren't yet up to the task, and that we need to get there. And innovation is the ideal way of doing that, not the courts. And so I guess as we're closing, getting away from litigation, if we could wave a magic wand and the litigation's all gone, what should policymakers be prioritizing when it comes to kind of developing working solutions? How can policymakers help kind of incentivize this innovation to help address our climate challenges?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of hard work, right? I mean, it's the hard work of legislating and regulating and working with manufacturers and other entities to figure out what's possible, what's doable, what can get done, how they can help in that process. And that's going to be dependent on each type of technology and each community and each sector of the economy that they're working with. Again, the key is to stay focused on those issues. It's not to say, let's file a lawsuit. Let's, go outside of that system to do something that frankly is not going to work and is an abuse of that other process.
So finally, Phil, for our last question, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy over a glass of great California wine. So when you're thinking about all these issues that you're working on, what beer, wine, cocktail, or other beverage are you enjoying to take your mind off all these bad climate change lawsuits?
All of them. My wife and I really enjoy a glass of red wine. I've got cousins in Sonoma who occasionally share some good wine with me. Sunsay Winery is one of their favorites, so I'll throw that out there. Delicious wine. There's obviously lots of good wine in Napa and Sonoma, but my drink of choice over the past few years, I've been migrating to rye whiskey, which in Maryland, where I live, is kind of one of our homegrown spirits. And I also did a bourbon tour in Kentucky last year, and that was amazing. And Angel's Envy rye that's finished in rum casks. That's an amazing one as well. So yeah, all of them.
Well, Phil, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.